Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to Columbia Ethics Grand Round. I'm Maya Sabatello, Associate Professor in the Division of Ethics and the Department of Medicine at Columbia University Irving Medical Center. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to today's Grand Round entitled School Vaccination Programs in Crisis, Consent, Coercion, and Justice. For those of you who are new to Ethics Grand Round, this monthly series is organized by the Division of Ethics in the Department of Medical Humanities and Ethics at the VPNS here at Columbia University. The goal of Ethics Grand Rounds is to engage our community of health professionals, scholars, scientists, and trainees across career stages and disciplines by centering important topics and debates in medical ethics that relate to clinical practice, research, and education. Our hope is that attendees will leave each session with a greater understanding of the ethical and social implications of the topic that was discussed. This series is supported by a dedicated organizing committee of faculty and division staff, for whom I'm really grateful. Before I turn to our topic for today, I'd like to remind our large audience online to please check the chat for logistics and other information for this session. Following our speaker's presentation, we will move into the discussion portion of today's session, where we'll accept questions from the audience, and that would include both people who are in person as well as people who are remote. Today's session is being recorded, and the recording will be uploaded as a resource to the Columbia Division of Ethics website following this event. Now to the focus of today's Ethics Grand Round. So the past few years have seen a growingly intense discussion and debate on the vaccination of children in school settings and beyond it. The COVID-19 pandemic had played a major role in the growing debate, with vaccine mandates coming across the country and requiring children to vaccinate before attending schools as well as adults. But this debate that seems to have started just about 5 years ago is actually going way back. And as we have seen in the past few months, it is likely to occupy our attention in the near future and probably further future as well. We see states that are taking different approaches to this question of whether children should be vaccinated, and if so, for which conditions. We see parents making different decisions about whether or not to vaccinate their children, when and for what. And we see clinicians and public experts standing in the middle, trying to figure out themselves how to balance first of all, what they're thinking, but also what they have to do for the best of for the health of both children and the general public. So the questions of whether vaccinating children really raises many ethical, legal, and social questions that we should all consider. And they include the legitimate scope of parental rights in the only country in the world that has not ratified the Children's Rights Convention. We have to consider the legitimate powers of states in regulating such issues, including how to balance the rights and interests of children, parents, families, and the general public. We have to think about who is to determine for what children are being vaccinated and when, and how to move forward at times of acute polarization surrounding childhood vaccines mandates. So our ethics grand rounds today will address some of these issues. And I'm truly delighted and honored to have Dr. James Colgrove join us today. Dr. Colgrove is the Dean of the Postbaccalaureate Pre-Medical Program at the Columbia School of General Studies and a professor of Socio-Medical Sciences at the Columbia Mailman School of Public Health. James, with no further ado, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that nice introduction, Maya. Welcome, everybody. Really great to see everybody here, and welcome to all of you online. How's that? Am I good? All right. Since the appointment 1 year ago of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as Secretary of Health and Human Services, the system that supports routine childhood immunization in this country has been in crisis. Last summer, Kennedy fired all 17 members of the CDC's Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, and many of the replacement members that he appointed have openly expressed anti-vaccination views. Last month, the committee issued a widely condemned revision of the childhood vaccination schedule that dramatically reduced the number of routinely recommended vaccines. The American Academy of Pediatrics described the changes as dangerous and unnecessary. The CDC's website now includes Orwellian language resurrecting the long discredited link between vaccines and autism. And these changes have been accompanied by a host of other policy shifts designed to undermine confidence in vaccine safety and to impede access to recommended vaccines. These changes come amid polls showing that increasing number of parents are delaying or skipping recommended vaccines for their children. Meanwhile, the U.S. break in decades, with now getting close to, I think, 1,000 cases in China, which in turn follows last year's measles outbreak in West Texas, 700 cases. Even before the appointment of Robert Kennedy Jr. As HHS Secretary, a critical component of the country's system for achieving high vaccination rates was already coming under attack. School vaccination laws, which exist in all 50 states, are one of the most effective interventions that we have for maintaining high levels of herd immunity in this country and protecting against the spread of infectious diseases. These laws have been subject to numerous legal and legislative challenges over the past couple of decades from parents and people who do not believe that children should be required to be vaccinated as a condition for attending school. The federal government has no direct role in deciding what vaccinations are mandatory for school attendance. That authority rests with states. But as reported in the Times last week, Kennedy's MAHA allies are moving aggressively at the state level, and what was formerly a fringe idea is now, oops, did I do that? What was formerly a fringe idea is now moving into the mainstream. In addition to being of tremendous public health benefit, school vaccination laws also raise a number of interesting ethical questions around coercion, consent, communal well-being, child welfare, parental autonomy, and justice. And there is not full consensus among bioethics about these questions. So my goal today in this talk is to examine the ethical and political dimensions of school vaccination policy. I'll start off by describing the recent history of the debates over compulsory school vaccination. I'll then consider the potential ethical problems that these laws may raise and some of the potential ethical justifications for them. And then I'll conclude with some thoughts on the current policy landscape and where we go from here. So to start off, I want to have a pop quiz. I'm going to read a statement. Is this statement true or false? A child may receive an exemption from New York State's compulsory school vaccination law if the child's parent has a sincerely held religious belief contrary to vaccination. Is that statement true? Is that statement false? All right, most people got this wrong. That statement is false. But if you said true, don't feel bad, because the answer to that question used to be true until about 7 years ago. It was in 2019 that New York State changed its vaccination law to remove the exemption for religious belief. And I'll say more in a moment about why the state made that change. I wouldn't say the move was hugely controversial, but it did generate a fair amount of protest in some quarters, such as this rally up in Albany as the state legislature was debating changing the law. And so you can see the messages that are being advanced there. It's a parent's right to choose, accompanied by, of course, the classic icon of freedom, the Statue of Liberty. And notice the sign in the middle, where there is risk, there must be choice. So when I first started noticing that slogan appearing in anti-vaccination materials about a decade ago, one of the first things I thought was, that sounds like something a bioethicist might say. So vaccination, like any medical intervention, carries some risk. Now, to be clear, the vast majority of vaccine side effects are transient and superficial. The risk of a severe vaccine adverse event is extremely low and is far outweighed by the risks of the diseases that vaccines protect against. But the ethical issue that's being raised here, I think, is a legitimate one, and I think it deserves to be taken seriously. Is it ethically permissible to coerce someone to undergo a medical intervention or to submit their child to a medical intervention? At least on its face, such a law might appear to violate established norms around informed consent and bodily integrity. So how do we answer this question? I think depends in part on the availability of exemption provisions, right? So it could be argued that a school vaccination mandate with an opt-out provision is not truly coercive in any meaningful sense of the word, or at least you might say if there's an opt-out, it's only minimally coercive. So all states allow parents to enroll their children in school unimmunized, but the provisions of those exemptions are not uniform across states. So vaccination exemptions come in two varieties, medical and non-medical. All states have the first kind, medical exemptions for children who have some kind of contraindication that would make vaccination a danger to them. Children who are immune compromised, children who have a history of seizures. Most states also have non-medical exemptions, and those come in two varieties. Religious, for any sincerely held belief that is rooted in a person's religious faith and practice, and philosophical or personal belief exemptions, which are for kind of anything that a parent believes that is contrary to vaccination. In the 2010s, several states moved in the direction of making their school vaccination laws more restrictive, that is, more coercive, by narrowing or removing exemption provisions. And this trend was catalyzed in part by repeated outbreaks of vaccine-preventable diseases that were attributed in part to diminished herd immunity resulting from too many parents claiming exemptions from school vaccination requirements. The most notable of these outbreaks was a multi-state measles outbreak in 2015 that originated from exposures at Disneyland in Southern California that resulted in almost 150 cases of measles in the US, Mexico, and Canada. It was in the aftermath of that outbreak that California, which had previously had one of the most liberal exemption policies in the country, eliminated all non-medical exemptions. And that move was quite controversial and generated pretty widespread and sustained protest. This was one such protest at the state capitol in California. And you can see in the signs the protesters are carrying, you see messages about safety. So the claim of autism, my sister had a vaccine reaction. And you also see claims about rights and freedom and liberty's opposite, tyranny. So this discourse is very politically powerful. I think it's arguably the most politically powerful discourse that we have in our civic culture. And these claims have a very long history. You find the phrase medical tyranny in anti-vaccination materials in the 19th century. Around the time California changed its law, several leading medical and public health organizations called upon all states to eliminate all non-medical exemptions. The American Medical Association, American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Public Health Association. New York State, which had had its own severe measles outbreak in upstate, changed its law around this time, as did Connecticut and Maine. In the last several years, however, the pendulum has swung hard in the other direction, with many states now moving to make their laws more liberal, to make it easier for parents to opt out, and in some cases considering eliminating school requirements altogether. And this shift is directly attributable to COVID. So you may recall that attempts to mandate newly developed COVID vaccines provoked a furious public backlash. That opposition was directed against efforts to require adults to be vaccinated through measures such as workplace requirements. But as early as the summer of 2022, there were signs that the backlash against COVID vaccination mandates for adults was having a spillover effect on school vaccination requirements for children. As reported in The Nation's Health in July of 2022, emboldened by inroads against COVID vaccination requirements, a surge of bills in state legislatures are taking aim at routine vaccinations for children. According to the Kaiser Family Foundation, since 2021, state lawmakers have introduced more than 2,500 pieces of legislation related to vaccines, and almost half of those are related to vaccine mandates. In 2025, at least 10 states enacted legislation or made changes in administrative law related to vaccination requirements, and almost all of these changes had to do with easing the restrictiveness of vaccine mandates. So this is the current situation in the US. So all 50 states offer medical exemptions. All 50 states have vaccination requirements. All 50 states offer medical exemptions. In 4 states only, that is the gray states, California, New York, Connecticut, and Maine, that is the only type of exemption that you can get for your child, is a medical exemption. All other states offer exemptions either for religiously based objections, philosophically based objections, or both. So the states here that have that are in navy blue have the most, make it the easiest for parents to opt out. So how do we think about the ethics of these mandates? On a purely utilitarian calculation, I think school vaccination laws are easily defensible. They work. There is a large empirical literature demonstrating the relationship between robustly enforced school mandates and high levels of protection against infectious diseases. And conversely, the relationship between high rates of exemptions from school requirements and the risk of outbreaks of infectious diseases. A widespread rollback in these laws, which we are currently risking, would be a calamity for public health and would undoubtedly result in many preventable illnesses and deaths. Bioethicists, of course, tend to be skeptical of utilitarian arguments like this, and some bioethicists have argued that the critical ethical imperative to respect a parent's right to choose cannot be overridden on such consequentialist grounds. So in the 1970s, a time when school vaccination laws were becoming more widespread and current norms around clinical informed consent were being codified, the bioethicist Leroy Walters, a very eminent bioethicist at Georgetown, commented on the divergent path between public health and clinical medicine. He said, in the patient-physician relationship, we have seen an increasing emphasis on patient autonomy. In the public health arena, the momentum in the 1970s has been in the opposite direction. He goes on, several state legislatures have passed new mandatory immunization laws. In this public health context, there is little or no room for individual autonomy and informed consent. A similarly critical tone was taken by another very eminent Georgetown bioethicist, Robert Veitch, who wrote in 1987, morally, the case for pressures or force to produce herd immunity is hard to make. So are Walters and Veitch correct? Are school vaccination laws ethically suspect or impermissible because of their effect on individual and parental autonomy? So to take the temperature of the room, I'm going to ask for another show of hands. Requiring children to be vaccinated before attending school is an ethically acceptable intrusion on parental autonomy. It is ethically acceptable. Who agrees with that statement? Okay. Who disagrees with that statement? Okay, so for those of you online, everybody in the room, their hand went up for agree. So I hope that we will hear from those of you who expressed your opinion when we get to the Q&A. So I would like to now set forth three ethical arguments that I believe support a compulsory school vaccination law, and we'll examine each one and sort of see how well it holds up and examine potential objections to these. So one potential justification is to prevent harm to third parties, to other members in the community. So vaccinating a child obviously is something that you do for the benefit of that child, but it also is something that you do to protect the children and the people around that child. So you want to prevent the child from unintentionally harming other members of the community. And so this justification is rooted in the harm principle set forth by the 19th century political philosopher John Stuart Mill in On Liberty. The harm principle holds that the state may legitimately enact coercive measures in order to prevent someone from harming another person. So a harm principle-based argument would simply say, unvaccinated children may harm others. But let's examine that claim a little more closely. Does the failure to vaccinate one's child harm others? Well, maybe, maybe not. After all, any unvaccinated child might pass on a disease, but they might not. So the likelihood of transmission depends in part on the epidemiological context. And it would vary according to the prevalence and the transmissibility of the disease in question. In the context of the spread of a highly contagious respiratory disease, a harm principle-based argument that would be, I think, easier to make because the risk of harm to others from measles and pertussis could be quite significant. So I think it would be very easy to make a harm principled argument today in South Carolina, where measles is spreading like wildfire. On the other hand, a harm principle-based argument would be less easy to make in the context of diseases that don't spread readily in school or congregate settings, like HPV, or diseases that aren't transmissible at all, like tetanus, both of which are diseases that some states do require vaccination for. So there is disagreement in the bioethical literature about whether refusing to vaccinate one's child is an act that poses a sufficiently imminent or proximal risk of harm to legitimately invoke state authority. And some bioethics scholars, like Tim Dare at the University of Auckland, have argued that the risk of allowing one's child to remain unvaccinated does not rise to the threshold of harm such that we can invoke the harm principle as a justification for coercion. A second possible justification for coercion is the doctrine of parens patriae. So this translates as parent of the country, and this is the legal doctrine that says that the state has not only a right, but actually a duty to protect people who are unable to act on their own behalf. A role that commonly involves protecting minors, as well as incompetent persons, people who are cognitively or decisionally impaired. So parens patriae is the concept that, for example, underpins removing a child from an abusive home, or a court awarding custody to one parent over another, even if that may not be the decision that either parent wants. So this argument for compulsory school vaccination is slightly different from the harm principle-based argument I just described. This is not saying to the parent, we require you to vaccinate your child to protect other people in the community. This is saying we require you to vaccinate your child to protect that child themselves. So the idea that it is appropriate for the state to protect children from the harmful acts of their parents is well accepted in both ethics and law. But in practice, this is a very, very murky area. In our society, we give parents quite a bit of leeway to raise their children as they see fit. And I think most of us would agree that's probably a good thing. The question of when the state has a right or a duty to override parental choice has sparked controversy in many contexts, both within healthcare and outside of healthcare, on issues such as compliance with mandatory education laws or prohibitions on child labor. Some people have argued that not vaccinating children against serious or potentially life-threatening infectious diseases constitutes a kind of child neglect. But as with a harm principle-based arguments, not all bioethics scholars agree with this. A small number of court cases have dealt with this issue, and at least some courts have ruled that withholding vaccination from a child, particularly in the context of a rapidly spreading respiratory disease, does constitute a kind of medical neglect. The third potential rationale for compulsory school vaccination I want to present to you is in order to avoid the problem of free riders. So the free rider problem is a kind of collective action problem. So people who use a public good without shouldering their fair share of the cost. Classic examples of public goods are things like national defense, public radio, street lights, fire protection. We all pay for these goods through our tax dollars, and we enjoy the benefits that redound to all of us. In the context of vaccination, the public good is herd immunity, also known as community immunity or community protection. This is the phenomenon that when a high enough proportion of a population is vaccinated against an infectious disease, everyone in the community is protected, even people who are themselves unvaccinated. So the free rider problem is, among other things, a problem of justice. It's not fair that some people are using a benefit that the rest of us pay for. And when I say pay for, I'm not referring to the economic costs of vaccines. I'm talking about the discomfort and inconvenience and the small risk of having an adverse reaction that we all assume when we undergo vaccination. So in gaining protection from an infectious disease, an individual's most self-interested strategy might be to allow everyone else to assume the small risk of vaccination, but avoid vaccination for themselves, knowing that they will be protected by herd immunity. And if too many people make that choice, herd immunity deteriorates, and you end up with a kind of variation of the tragedy of the commons. So this is a collective action problem. It's a problem of justice where my child is bearing the burden, and your child is gaining the benefit. The benefits and the burdens of vaccination are not being fairly distributed. One potential objection to this ethical argument is herd immunity really a public good? Can we consider herd immunity a public good? Well, it fits the standard 2 criteria for a public good. It's non-excludable, meaning that if it is available to some people in the community, it's available to everyone. And it's non-rivalrous, meaning that my being protected by herd immunity does not in any way diminish your being protected by herd immunity. So those are 3, I think, at least plausible justifications for compulsory school vaccination laws. And as debates over these laws continue to rage in courtrooms and legislatures around the country, I think it's more important than ever that supporters of these laws are able to clearly articulate their ethical justification. But of course, ethical arguments by themselves are not going to carry the day. Nobody is going to influence a policy outcome by citing John Stuart Mill or talking about non-excludable public goods. What is needed is political advocacy that can translate ethical arguments into compelling narratives. So where does that leave us? Attacks on school vaccination mandates are gathering force around the country. Last April, Idaho became the first state to ban vaccination mandates in schools and workplaces. And you might have noticed on the map that I showed you a few slides ago that Idaho was color-coded as having vaccination mandates. That's because those mandates are still on the books. They haven't updated their health code yet, although this new law essentially renders those mandates unenforceable, and the state is now in the process of removing the mandates from their health code. And last September, a planned repeal of all school vaccination mandates was announced by the Florida Health Commissioner, Joseph Ladapo, who compared compulsory school vaccination to slavery. Plans to enact similar so-called medical freedom acts are under development in Louisiana, Texas, and other states. So the good news is that nationwide, large majorities of the public continue to support school requirements for vaccination. Kaiser Family Foundation, Pew, Gallup, and other polling operations generally show upwards of 75 to 80% of respondents agreeing that children should be required to be vaccinated in order to attend school. However, overall support for that position has declined post-COVID, and wide gaps have now opened up in levels of support for school mandates along the lines of partisan political identification. So the bars above the horizontal line are showing you the percentage of respondents who agree with the statement, healthy children should be required to be vaccinated to attend public schools because of the potential risk to others, so a harm principle-based argument. The bars below the horizontal line show the percentage of respondents agreeing with the statement, parents should be able to decide not to vaccinate their children, even if that may create health risks for others. And so you can see, you see that? Yes. So you can see that in 2016 and 2019, pre-COVID, about 4 out of 5 respondents supported the idea of school mandates. And then you can see that post-COVID, in March of 2023 and October of 2025, support for that position has dropped by about 10 percentage points. And then you can see that when you stratify by political orientation, the decline has been basically entirely among Republican voters, and that almost half of all Republican voters believe that parents should be able to decide not to vaccinate their children, even if that may create health risks for others. Meanwhile, you can see that support has actually modestly increased among respondents who identify as Democratic. And this finding is actually consistent with the trend showing that attitudes towards science and medicine and public health are increasingly matters of partisan political identity. And this is of great concern for many reasons, partly because we know from psychological research that once a policy position becomes sort of a matter of one's identity, it becomes very, very difficult to change. And I consider this politicization to be the greatest current threat to public health overall and to our civic democracy. Attitudes towards childhood immunization requirements are a uniquely revealing barometer of the strength of our civic ties, our sense of mutual obligations, and our beliefs about what we all owe to each other. So I will conclude there. I would love to hear your questions and comments. I think Maya is going to come up and moderate the discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Colgrove. So I think I'm going to have actually a first question from the presentation. I'll take essentially the prerogative. One is if you can share a little bit of the court cases that came up in that context of school vaccines. And related to that, have they really focused on COVID or other types of vaccines?
Both. So over the last couple of decades, and actually going back to the 60s, 70s, and 80s, there have been a number of court challenges to school vaccination laws, specifically around the issue of exemptions. And the main claim that has been litigated, the main question was, does a school mandate that does not contain a religious exemption burden the practice of religion? Does it violate First and 14th Amendment against burdening freedom of religion? Here, I'm going to give my standard disclaimer, which is I am not a lawyer. Fortunately for me, I'm talking to one. So please correct me if I get any of the finer points of law incorrect. Courts have reached different decisions about this question. Generally, courts have held that not having a religious exemption does not violate any constitutional right. There have been a couple of courts that have disagreed with that, but mostly the decisions in cases in the 60s through the 90s and then a few in the early 2000s held that, in fact, states are not obligated to provide a religious exemption. And in reaching these decisions, they often referred back to a very famous case from the 1940s called Prince v. Massachusetts, which was actually not about vaccination. It was a child labor case, but in dicta, it had a reference to school vaccination, and it said there's a line in that ruling that says the right to practice religion freely does not include the right to endanger the health of the child or the community, to expose the child or the community to ill health or death. So that was the situation leading up to COVID. During COVID, a number of public health restrictions were challenged on religious grounds. So there were cases, for example, that challenged restrictions on public gatherings where churches were barred from gathering, and people sued that as a violation of their religious freedom. And what we saw during COVID was that courts began to diverge from this decade-old view of saying that public health sort of overrode religious practice. And Michelle Mello and Wendy Parmet and other legal scholars have documented these cases, analyzed these cases quite extensively. And many public health regulations were struck down because on the argument that they were burdening religious practice. And so courts essentially started to say during COVID, well, actually, the right to practice religion freely does include the right to expose the community to ill health. So a very kind of troubling trend. Where this has been most visible with school laws is that a couple of years ago, an ally of Robert Kennedy brought a court case in Mississippi. So Mississippi had no religious exemption. That law was successfully challenged, and a court held that the failure to offer a religious exemption was constitutionally unacceptable. Since then, in the aftermath of that case, Mississippi was required to add a religious exemption to its school vaccination law. So I think that I would predict that any state that now does not offer, I think the 4 states that do not offer religious exemptions, I think probably those laws are vulnerable to challenge based on some recent jurisprudence that we've seen.
Thank you very much. What I'm hearing here, and I'm trying to figure out, so obviously there was debate before COVID. The COVID obviously touched a very sensitive point. Religious freedom is one of them. But is it also just that that was probably one of the first time that there is mandates towards adults rather than children?
Yes.
Or is it the scientific question of the rapid approval of the vaccine and how these two may be mixed together?
Yeah, exactly. I think it was both of those things, and they worked synergistically. So we don't really have the federal government has very little involvement in vaccination mandates. And so we don't have a tradition of the federal government issuing mandates the way that Joe Biden did when he issued his two mandates. We don't have a tradition in this country of requiring adults to be mandated, except in very kind of narrow circumstances like around immigration. Um, and so the idea that suddenly now the federal government was mandating adults to get vaccinated was very, I think it triggered all of this political blowback because it was just a foreign concept for people. And it was coming in the aftermath of a development of a vaccine that was faster than anything that had ever been done. And so there were all sorts of concerns that this is too new and it hasn't been sufficiently studied, and how can it be safe if we got it to market in 9 months when it usually takes 7 years. And so it was sort of a perfect storm of reasons that people would object to vaccination.
Thank you. I'm going to pick up one question here from the Q&A, which is actually, so we have the mandates that basically parents can now try to move out of them. But what if a child under 18 would like to be vaccinated and their parents refuses?
Yeah, it's a great question that came up. You may remember there were some notable cases during COVID of older adolescents, 15, 16, 17, wanting to get the vaccine against their parents' wishes. This had also come up previously in the aftermath of the licensing of the HPV vaccination. So we saw in the sort of the 20 teens some cases of, for example, 13 and 14-year-olds wanting to get the HPV vaccine for themselves and not being able to consent to it. So the laws, as you know, the laws around adolescent consent for medical services is quite
sexual relationship. It's slightly different.
Yeah, I mean it's a complex legal area that varies by state. There is this idea of so-called sensitive services whereby adolescents can consent to treatment of STIs. And the question that came up with HPV was, well, HPV is not a treatment exactly, it's a preventive. And so could an adolescent receive it under those sensitive services laws? So this idea of what sort of turning that on its head, well, we're not forcing the child. What if the child wants it and the parent does it? It's a complex legal area. And I defer to you on the law around sensitive services.
Well, so have other countries taken different approaches to that? Especially, again, the United States is the only country that has not ratified the Children's Rights Convention, including its provisions about the child's voice, increasing voice, the requirement that we will listen to what children have to say, especially once they show capacity to make those decisions. Have other states addressed these challenges differently?
Other countries, you mean?
Other countries, not others,
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question. Countries around the world deal with this issue in many different ways, and there are, as we look at different countries, there are many kind of lessons learned about sort of what kind of policies and policy levers they're using. The US uses compulsory vaccination in schools more extensively than most other countries. But we aren't the only country that does that. Several European countries, Australia, countries that we might consider sort of peer nations also have compulsory school vaccination. And interestingly, in the 2010s, France and Italy both enacted major revisions to their compulsory school vaccination laws that made them much more strict and much more extensive. So France added, I think, 11 new vaccines and reduced parents' abilities to opt out. And they did that in response to two related things. One, increasing outbreaks of infectious diseases and higher reported rates of vaccine skepticism. So in France, you may be interested to know, like, has the highest rates of vaccine skepticism in the world as measured in various ways. It's just off the charts. I thought it was very interesting that France's response to that was to use coercion even more aggressively. You might worry about that causing a backlash, although I'm not aware that that's happened. But so in answer to your question, some countries don't actually mandate the vaccination for school attendance, but they mandate attestation of the decision, right? So parents have to submit a form that says, I understand that it is recommended, I decline, but they don't, they just have to document that they've given it some thought. That's another way that you could do it. If you look at other countries, some have mandates for a small number of diseases. Some have various kinds of opt-out provisions. So there are lots of other models that we could look at.
Thank you. I'm going to combine two questions from the online audience. One is from Lisa Kearns and then from John Santelli. So one is, well, the ethical justifications that you gave for the vaccines, for the vaccine mandates seem to be very logical and reasonable. Why are they not enough to persuade in having them? And then relatedly, why some members of the political views here that we saw a very clear split between Republicans and Democrats, why some are taking them seriously versus others, and why the seriousness of childhood diseases is looked differently by these two political factions.
Why are logical arguments not taken seriously? Because we are not logical people. We are not sort of rational utility maximizers, and I don't exclude myself from that. People aren't rational. They don't make their decision based on rational argument. They base it on all sorts of affective dimensions and feelings and fears. This sort of gets to the point of the implications of these partisan splits. So the anthropologist Heidi Larson, who runs a group called the Vaccine Confidence Project at the London School, has this saying, which I often quote, which is, we don't have an information problem as much as we have a relationship problem, meaning that the people we're trying to persuade, we don't have their trust, we don't have their confidence that we are part of their tribe, right? So this hyperpartisanship and political polarization we are seeing is a kind of tribalism where you make your decision based more on who is the person telling you the information and what is their tribe, more than the substance of what they are saying. And why people make different assessments about the risk of infectious diseases, I think, is related to the way that some people are interpreting all empirical information about public health and whether it's credible or not through the lens of, well, who is telling me this?
Right. Well, again, two other questions here that are coming up, and I'm kind of, again, thinking about the risks and the challenges that come up. We hear a lot about the exemption for religious beliefs or even personal beliefs, right? But religious freedom, and that's a question from Arthur Kufleck. So the issue is religious freedom does not give us the right to harm others. And yet in this debate about vaccines mandates, we seem to completely just give up for religious freedom. And the question is why? Where are all the other rationales that play out? And why do, in most rights, we always have to, I don't have any complete right to do anything, essentially, except for the right to freedom, to life, to be free from torture. And we have debates about what the scope of that is as well, right?
Yeah.
Why are we taking the religious freedom to that extreme, to the point that it can allow hurting others?
Yeah, I mean, this was exactly the question that arose in COVID in some of those court cases that I alluded to, when courts started to essentially say that the right to practice religion freely does include the freedom to harm others. How we balance freedom of religion alongside of secular practices around things like public health has been a challenge throughout our history. And it's a complex balance, and it requires measuring values that aren't easily commensurable with each other, right? How do we balance a sort of quantifiable risk of disease transmission against the importance that unfettered religious practice plays in people's lives, and the meaning that that holds for them? How do you compare those things? And so, in a way, I think it's not surprising that people people of goodwill would reach different conclusions about that, and actually say, my practice of my faith is so important to me, and this principle is so important to me that it outweighs whatever risk it might entail. And then, of course, underlying that is different assessments of risk. And not everybody agreed, for example, that many people said the risk of COVID was inflated. So there's sort of an underlying empirical disagreement that then is being overlaid on this difference of values.
Right. Thank you. That's very informative. So two other kind of related questions to that. One is so if religious freedom is as such, how difficult or easy is it, the process to claim that exemption?
Yeah, this is an important question. So, and it has been studied a fair amount. So this sort of apropos of your point about international variation, this is something that varies among countries and among US states. So you can actually, depending on what kind of procedures you have in place, you can make it very easy, or procedurally, you can make it extremely difficult to get a vaccination. And those procedural aspects actually are extremely influential in the number of exemptions that are claimed, which is probably not surprising. So, for example, a jurisdiction can require that anybody who wants an exemption has to undergo a counseling session with a public health professional or a medical professional explaining the risks of vaccine preventable diseases. You can require people to get their form notarized. You can require people to renew the exemption every year. So in some places, like you enter high school, you get the exemption and you've got it for the entire time your child is at that school, but you could also require people to renew it every year. So there's all sorts of procedural things you can make it easier to do. And there have been studies of jurisdictions with easy, sort of low burden and high burden procedures. And definitely the easier you make it to get exemptions, the more people are going to take the exemptions.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think we have a question.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was wondering, yes. I was wondering to what degree you think a matter of semantics has kind of entered this conversation. You spoke about this tribalism that's kind of happening with different political groups kind of taking the stance of being very opposed to vaccines or being pro-vaccines. But I wonder if with COVID, the idea of like what a vaccine is kind of changed, and if you think there'd be any merit into kind of using different terminology or kind of differentiating, maybe not even calling the MMR vaccine a vaccine, but something else.
I think it would help. I mean, definitely our communication strategies matter a lot. That's something that we certainly learned in COVID, is that public health as a field has learned much too late, is that we really need to pay attention to the terms that we're using and how we're describing things. I guess I would go back to Heidi Larson's comment about information versus relationships. I don't think that we're not going to win these arguments with better terms or better logic. I guess I would say they are necessary, but probably not sufficient. Like, yes, we absolutely have to look at the language that we're using. We have to make sure that we're using the best possible communication strategies that we have. But ultimately, at the end of the day, people will respond to us or not respond to us based on how they perceive us as messengers, and are we part of their tribe? Yeah, it's a great question.
Just one more question before we wrap up. Go ahead.
Hi there. Hi, I'm Magda Shaler-Haynes. I teach
Hi, Magda.
public health law and vaccine law here. I'm so glad for this conversation. I have a comment and a question. The comment first is that within public health, we don't even require our students to learn anything about law. And so that it's my view, an omission within the field that we're bringing up generations of public health practitioners and leaders who don't even who aren't required to learn anything about kind of the constitutional principles that you've just so astutely described. So I think we can do better on that as a field. More conversations like this. And the second one is a question about heterogeneity within religion, because most religions actually don't oppose vaccination, and it's typically a pretextual claim to avoid the obligation to get vaccinated. And courts, understandably, nor do epidemiologists generally want to dig deeper into the sincerity or theology behind a person's invocation of a religious exemption. I'm curious if you have kind of a view on ethics of that and in that tricky territory.
Yeah, it is indeed tricky. So New York State, before they got rid of their religious exemption, if you wanted to claim a religious exemption, you had to have a meeting with a representative of the school district who asked you a whole series of questions about the strength and the sincerity of your religious belief. And so they would ask, well, what other kinds of decisions about your children's health have you made based on this religious belief? How long have you held this religious belief? And how courts really don't like it when people start to mess with interrogating people's religious belief, but they have held that courts that states can look at strength and sincerity, and that is another way that you could make it easier or harder for somebody to opt out. And in fact, what some states who want to make their exemptions more broad are doing is saying that you can't do that kind of interrogation of religious belief. That's what happened in Mississippi. If somebody comes to you and says, I have a religious exemption, you give it to them. You don't even ask any question about what's the basis of this religious belief. Your point about, most religions don't prescribe vaccination is an excellent one. The only sort of prominent or major one is Christian Science. And in fact, the reason that we have these laws historically is because Christian scientists advocated for them in the 1960s and 1970s when they were becoming widespread. Some plaintiffs have made religious arguments in court, either because there are some vaccines that were originally developed using cell lines derived from terminated fetuses. And some people have cited language in sacred texts that they interpret as prescribing vaccination. So, for example, the commandment to keep the body pure before God. Some people have said, well, that to me means don't object vaccines into my body. But it is a very tricky area. 100% about needing legal training. Many students can't get into your class because it's because it's too popular and too full. So there is definitely an interest among students and absolutely a need for it.
Thank you. And we have to wrap up. I know there are more questions, but maybe later.
I can hang out.
But Dr. Colgrove, I really want to thank you for this wonderful, insightful, and so important conversation and presentation today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. And thank you all to our wonderful audience for your thoughtful questions. Again, I know there are more questions that are still there. The recording of this event will soon be posted on Columbia's Division of Ethics website. Our next grant rounds will be on March 17th with Dr. Yulina Pyle. Use the link in the chat to register for this session. And in the meantime, please subscribe to the mailing list to stay up to date on details on our upcoming events. For those of you who are joining in person, please complete a brief survey to provide your feedback on today's event. And the survey can be found in the back of the room on the table. I'm not sure if it is on the table over there. Farine is just pointing it out. For those online, a brief survey will be automatically displayed on your screen once this webinar ends. We appreciate that so many of you joined us today, and I really want to wish all of you a happy and wonderful rest of the week. Thank you very much.